Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. I'm delighted to have Mark Stahlman and Peter Berkman back. And we are going to be talking about the state of modern psychology and what Thomas Aquinas' view of senses, inner senses, especially the cogitative sense, has to offer to us. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much, Srikant.
Hi, and welcome, Peter.
Hey, how you doing?
Wonderful. So, Mark, I'm going to throw it to you. So please tell us what state are we in and where are we right now?
First, again, let me thank not just Srikant, but all the rest of you for putting up with this difficult material. I'll remind you that Peter and I began in earnest more than 5 years ago, working on these topics. And we finally have managed, along with the help of Adam Pugin, who can't be with us today, to publish this on the Center for the Study of Digital Life's website. So that is digitallife.center. And you'll find a journal tab across the top of the page. And so what we're talking about are various aspects of what we have published there. This material has never been discussed publicly in a group setting before. And so I have to thank Srikant in particular again for his wisdom in putting this material forward. I want to start by making a suggestion, which is a little bit out of order here, and you can do this obviously later on. I'm not asking you to necessarily do this right now, but when you get a chance, please go to Wikipedia and take a look at the 2 entries for pattern recognition. One of them is listed as pattern recognition parentheses psychology, and the other is just pattern recognition, and it's referring, of course, to robots. And so my challenge to you will be to try to figure out what the difference is. The Wikipedia entries for pattern recognition for the human being talk about comparing inputs, information, to memory. As a one-time computer architect, that sounds a whole lot like what I did when I designed computers. What does that have to do with humans? So we may have a chance to return to this later on in this session. The second thing I want to highlight for you is that Peter and I are going to try to keep our contribution briefer than it has been for the past couple of weeks. We've run out of time at the end. And so there we are, 2 hours, 15 minutes, 20 minutes into all of this. There's another meetup coming in another 10 minutes. Everybody's scrambling. And so hopefully Peter and I will be done with this by the top of the hour. That will then allow us to have a much longer time period, hopefully, for Q&A at the end of all of this, which I think has been lacking, given the extensive discussions that Peter, I, and Adam actually have all had. Modern psychology dates to the late 1950s. It was the result of many factors, one of which was cybernetics, which my father was deeply involved with as a protege of Norbert Wiener. He was actually at the party where the name cybernetics was invented by going through Greek mythology. Another of them was really the failure of behaviorism, and who is Skinner and Watson and many others. Bill has put the fathers of psychology before what I'm now talking about. None of the people on the screen here are modern psychologists. In fact, of the three, no one pays attention really much to Freud anymore, except for some strange French postmodernists. Few people pay attention to Skinner. Jung, of course, of the three, has probably been the most successful in his longevity, but I would suggest that's because he is a religious figure, not a psychologist. But in any event, the modern psychology we're talking about today is called cognitive psychology. And what we want to contrast with cognitive is cogitative. They seem like they're very much the same word. They are very much not the same word. The rise of cognitive psychology in the late 1950s has a whole nother cast of characters that are not on Bill's screen, one of whom is Donald Norman. Don Norman is a fellow who used to show up at technology conferences, and one night on expense account, I bought a $400 bottle of vintage port, and Don Norman and I sat up for hours discussing the early days of cognitive psychology. And how is it that this modern psychology came to pattern human beings on computers? Don is a very successful and famous fellow, a bunch of books and a lot of consulting clients. He has been responsible for a lot of what we would today call user interfaces. So he's a designer of how to make a computer be comfortable for humans in software. And his story was a fairly dramatic one. It was all about conflicts and failures and the need to replace a whole series of efforts that had not panned out. And so the scandal of the failure of early 20th century psychology, the three figures on the right on Bill's screen behind him, was very, very palpable. I'll also note for you, without going into much detail, that there was a sea change in the way academia was organized around these topics. The predecessor to much of that happened at Harvard, where they had a very difficult time in the early 20th century sorting these things out. The early 20th century psychology lived in the philosophy department at Harvard until 1933. The sociology department at Harvard, they had hired a Russian to come in, and he was very prolific, but he didn't fit with the program. The program being, how do we use psychology to invent a new type of human being? And that is not what Freud, Jung, or Skinner were trying to do. And cognitive psychology became a much more aggressive effort. So I hope in the future we'll have a chance to talk about my paper as a contribution to volume 1 of Dia Noeticon, The Inner Senses and Human Engineering. So whatever human engineering dimensions may have been in Freud, Jung, and Skinner's mind, that went exponential after World War II. So the context here is the Germans, best educated, the entire US educational system in particular, have been patterned on the German university system. Our disciplines, our PhDs, all of these awards come from the German organization. That took place late 19th, early 20th century. You can imagine people's surprise when Hitler takes over in Germany. It would appear that the best educated, most stable, most methodical, most rational, in some sense, people on Earth had totally lost their minds. And how are we going to get to the bottom of this? How are we going to figure this out? Those three pictures, again, behind Bill, were really the only options that people had, and they were all tried, to be sure. But the fellow on the left was not considered at all. The reason why he was not considered at all, that's to say, St. Thomas Aquinas, is because Aquinas's association, his gang, so to speak, was the Catholic Church. And so if anybody was going to bring Thomas Aquinas into this conversation, it would have to be them. And they had many opponents. They also had many supporters. So it wouldn't necessarily have been, a totally devastating food fight. But the fact of the matter is the Catholic Church walked away. So in the early 20th century, something occurred. I'm not going to go into this in too great a detail. You can look it up. The Catholic Church wound up feeling as if they were under attack from every possible direction. And as you know from your Westerns, what happens when the Indians are coming at you from all directions is you circle the wagons. I probably should not use the term Indian in this discussion, so I'll be happy to say Native Americans, if you prefer, or Native North Americans. I'm told that the South Americans get very upset when you describe yourself as an American. I'm a North American.
Is a word people like to use also.
Indigenous, you say?
Perhaps.
Yeah. So when the indigenous were after the invaders, what did they do? They circled the wagons. And in the process of circling the wagons, many things had to be jettisoned. Another metaphor here would be an airplane that's losing altitude and is threatening to crash into the ground. What you do is you rummage through the back and you try to get rid of as much baggage as you can, so you clear the trees. And the Catholic Church discarded Thomas Aquinas's psychology in order to gain enough altitude to stay to some degree on course. We can discuss that history if you like. It's called the Modernist Crisis. From 1910, I believe, Peter, actually beginning a bit earlier with some material published in 2007, but from 1910 until 1965, following Vatican II, every priest and every instructor at every seminary had to actually physically sign an oath against modernism. This is a totally bizarre organizational maneuver which guaranteed that the Catholic Church was removed from every interesting conversation that occurred in the early 20th century, or perhaps later. So as a result, Aquinas was thrown under the bus, and a whole new series of efforts came into place. Following the disaster of World War II and the reorganization of social sciences, the result of that is this notion under cognitive psychology that you can model human beings on computers. And this, of course, is coincident with the rise of artificial intelligence. So the original work done by Herb Simon and others on AI is wrapped up in this whole switch. So you have, at the same time, people attempting to build artificial humans, while the academic understanding of the actual biological humans has come into alignment with computer view. So in this process, the humanities, as you might imagine, were discarded. And there's another whole long story to be told here about the abandonment of humanities in academia, the founding of the National Endowment for the Humanities to try to reverse that, and so forth. But here we are today with a completely hegemonic view of psychology that spills over into dozens of other fields, which is fundamentally wrong in the most fundamental fashion. I'll note for you that the people who are in that field recognize its own failure. So this is not something which is hoisting giant sails and dominating the seas, and this is not a successful program. Much as the early 20th century psychology collapsed, being replaced by modern cognitive psychology. Modern cognitive psychology has hundreds of detractors at this point. It's not very hard to find in the literature articles about a complete crisis in modern psychology. There are people out there who have, as you would expect, put their hands in the air to say, I'm the one who will fix all of this. So there are a bunch of people running around proclaiming that they can synthesize from everything that's ever happened a new version of psychology. Not to pick on him in particular, but some of you may have read the blog posts at Psychology Today of a fellow by the name of Greg Henriquez. Greg is very ambitious in this regard, so ambitious that when he met me, I was for a brief period his best friend forever. The reason why I became Greg's BFF is because I was bringing something into the conversation he'd never heard before. His goal was not to understand what I was talking about. His goal was not to do what we're doing today. His goal was to somehow get some super glue and stick it onto the side of the spaceship. So he was trying to just add more fins, more wings, so that ultimately no one could accuse him of having left anything out. Now, that of course winds up with the famous story about the camel, who was a horse designed by a committee. There's nothing ultimately satisfactory that can come from an exercise like that, and we've taken a very different approach. So our approach has been not how do we restore, not how do we rehabilitate, which is in the name for this particular session, but rather how do we retrieve a different psychology? And now to focus on the primary topic of today, and I'll be winding up if Peter's consumed his first cup of coffee of the day and is ready to join us. I'll be handing this off to there he goes. Peter often has a cup of coffee in his hands. I had dinner in Connecticut with Peter a week and a half ago, and there were a number of stops at a Starbucks or an equivalent as we were driving down the road. So I'm happy to see that Peter is getting his rocket fuel here. We're going to be talking about the cogitative sense. It has many other names. Faculties of the human soul are often described as powers in the literature. So cogitative power is another name you might find for this. But interestingly enough, it also winds up being named as a version of reason. And why this has happened, of course, is because we have to somehow translate our sensory experiences, both outer and inner, into something which can then be rationally deployed by our intellect. And as it turns out, the intellect is not considered within the Aristotelian Thomistic psychology as being a single thing. Needless to say, information is not being processed in any of this. So all the notions about the brain being an information processor, as Shrikant kindly warned you to begin with, for the purpose of this conversation, please set that aside. That is not what's going on here. in fact, what we call information is itself a disguise. It's a cover-up of something far more fundamental, which is formality, forms, formal cause. So the root in information is just a prefix and a suffix tacked onto the word form. The real challenge with anything that is described as information is, what did you really mean? There is no clear definition that I can find. And in particular, why are you disguising something that comes before that, which is more important, which is form and ultimately formal cause? So the four internal senses, just to remind you, sensus communis, or what we would in English call common sense, is the integrator of our external senses. Typically 5 are enumerated. That then stores its images in the imagination, which is a form of memory, but it's a form of memory which is effectively making copies and not trying to form any meaning associated with this. And so this is, in our view, where our lives have gone so wrong, which is to say we've lived in a television dominated world, whether we watch it or not. And television is made up of deliberately illusionary false images. So our imagination in this approach is filled with nonsense, literally, things that cannot be made sense of. A blinking light puppet show, which is what television is, has been transformed into something that we're supposed to try to make sense of. As Peter laid this out, the next crucial sense is the cogitative sense. And I have taken all of the various discussions and all of the treatises written on this, many of which in fact are published, and Shrikant was kind enough to do an excerpt of one of those, but you will find many discussions coming from different people at different times on the cogitative sense in our volume 1 of Dianoeticon, the Ecology of the Inner Senses. And it turns out that the faculty known as memory is where the cogitative sense deposits its meaning in process. And I have taken the liberty here, which is not correct, but may be helpful in this conversation, to reduce the enormously complicated character of meaning in process. So you'll note here that I'm playing the same sort of linguistic game that some others do by stringing a number of words together. The Germans do this all the time, of course. They don't bother with a hyphen. They just stack the words up on each other. Our favorite translator of Aristotle is named Joe Sachs. He did his work at St. John's in Annapolis. And he is quite enamored, I think correctly, of trying to translate difficult Greek words, including words that were made up by Aristotle. He had to coin new words for many things he was talking about. He uses hyphens. So being at work, staying itself, for instance, is Joe Sachs's translation of the very simple Greek word entellecti, which, as it turns out, almost all other translators translate entellecti as intellecti, reminding me of when I first went to Saudi Arabia and got a phrase book for Arabic. And as you will probably not be surprised, our term fruit salad turns into fruit salad in Arabic. This is the sort of thing that happens with words like this. The problem here.
Mark, could you repeat the translation of intellecti?
Intellecti, which is E-N-T-E-L, and so forth, Joe Sachs's translation of that is being at work, staying itself.
Okay.
So built into that is both the dynamic of being at work and the relatively static, holding things together of staying itself. This topic, obviously, of being and all of its manifestations then becomes a big deal with existentialism and Heidegger and so forth in the 20th century. So here we are. We've got a faculty which I am reducing all of its various capabilities for the purpose of this conversation to pattern recognition. Pattern recognition is not, and we all, I think, recognize this, pattern recognition is not a conscious process. We might, I'll give you an example. This morning I was working with Bill Frezza and John Alton on trying to crisp up our discussion for this consulting company we're starting called Exogenous Inc. And John Alton kept on using the word sage to describe the results of, in particular, the ideal person in a Taoist Chinese approach to the world. That would be a sage, S-A-G-E. And then I had a conversation with Bill, and Bill wound up talking about prophets. And somehow in that conversation, it was not a deliberate intellectual, certainly was not a logical, certainly was not a drilling down and comparing terms and making lists. It just popped into both of our heads. This is a fundamental difference between China and the West. In the West, we have prophets. In the East, we have sages. Now, I don't want to belabor the implication of that, except to say that it is absolutely world-shaping that these two civilizations have these two ideal sorts of characters. I'm just pointing out that coming to that required multiple people talking to each other and a subconscious that is operating on this, and it was our cogitative sense that then came to the, oh, I see, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fit together. Then the intellect takes that pattern and is able, with many other patterns and with lots of other items, including the phantasms that are associated with the images in the imagination, again, in this faculty psychology approach, it is then able to begin to build intellectual structures on top of this earlier recognition. One way of looking at this perhaps would be to think of this as this is the source of premises. If we're doing a logical argument, as you know, everyone has to agree to the premises. You're going to go to a debating society at Oxford, Cambridge, or wherever. The first step is, these are the premises we all agree to. Now we're going to debate the implications of that. Well, that leaves, of course, the question of where do the premises come from? Where do the patterns that we're all agreeing to come from? And the answer to that is the cogitative sense. Now, it feels to me like Peter might want to step in at this point and fill us in on a lot more significant detail about how the cogitative sense has been understood and what we really mean by it. Is that okay, Peter?
Wonderful.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Really appreciate that. That was a fantastic introduction to the whole thing. So Peter, what I would recommend is just let's start from the beginning again and talk about kind of all the faculties as Aquinas sees it and cogitative sense, because the thing is that this is a very deep topic. You have to repeat it multiple times from multiple angles for people to get it. Go ahead.
Thank you, Shrikant, and thanks everyone here. Yeah, so starting from the beginning, I'll bring back the sort of machine learning analogy, or rather it's where it breaks down. So Mark brought up 2 Wikipedia pages for pattern recognition, one being a machine learning one, and the other being parentheses psychology. So I would just say that human knowledge, human understanding, it turns out doesn't work the way that the 1999 film The Matrix would put it, where you plug something into your brain and all of a sudden you say, I know Kung Fu. We've had these things, computers, for a long time. And unfortunately, you still cannot implant a Google Translate chip into your brain, which will allow you to step into Germany or to Sweden or to China and walk around like a normal human being. There's something different going on. That is, knowledge is not a one-way street. So at the heart of that, though, and just this is before even introducing the notion of faculties in general, because faculties of the soul, of which the cogitative power is one, alongside these other inner and exterior senses and the intellect that and the will and all these other faculties, it doesn't really make sense to talk about them unless we really make this distinction of it being a matter of form rather than of I guess something linear, logical, deduced, something like that. So that is to say, it doesn't operate like a machine at all. You don't have to plug a human being in for it to be alive. You do not have to plug a plant in. What you do need is an ecology with other living things and other nutritive things. And for anything to really be alive at all, it needs to have these vegetative powers to it. So in Aristotle's distinction of the soul, and I just want to actually highlight here that Mark had brought up that the Catholic Church had some really big confusion in the 20th century over psychology and just walked away from the I guess battlefield. And in doing so, you'll find many people who say, well, only human beings have souls. You know, dogs don't have souls. But that's actually not what Aristotle believed, and it's not what St. Thomas Aquinas believed, or really anybody before probably the 20th century, before we got deeply confused about these matters. In fact, the word animal comes from the Latin anima, which is the Latin word for soul. The Greek word is psyche. Soul, I think, comes from German into English. But the whole point is that all of these different kinds of living beings have different kinds of souls.
Peter, can I make a quick comment here?
Sure, of course.
See, I find this to be a huge issue, because what happened is that after the success of Newton, everybody tried to imitate that way of thinking about everything. So they tried to look at living things as if they were kind of billiard ball models.
Exactly.
Darwin did not do that. You know, he kind of stepped back and kind of looked at, say, okay, what is a living thing? And all of this approach essentially comes back to going and looking at living things and human beings afresh, instead of deductively applying something that you have learned from physics into it forcefully, which doesn't really work. So it is kind of going back. And Darwin thought that Aristotle was the greatest biologist, before him, and he kind of founded the field. But go ahead, Peter.
I would just say Darwin, though you're right about this approach of merely approaching these things physically. I think Darwin and others in his time period failed to grasp metaphysics, which really starts scientifically. If you want to measure things empirically, you really can't do that without formal causality. And causality was really the thing erased in Newton's time, and really I don't think has fully been retrieved yet. In fact, we talked about McLuhan last week. He felt it necessary to actually reinvent the term in order for it to have any weight in science at all. And I think we're still, maybe we're already there. But just to go back to this notion of living things, I will say one thing about Darwin is that, he's studying the new, sorry, the name of his book is Problem of Species. No, not Problem of Species, but sorry.
Origin of Species.
What's that?
Origin of Species?
Origin of Species. Thank you. So he's really studying a kind of change in form. How does this form become that form? And you really can't do that without formal cause. McLuhan actually believed that Darwin took his format for that book from Ovid's Metamorphoses, but that's neither here nor there. So back to the forms of living things, which according to Aristotle are their souls, and maybe even their entelechies, their being at work, staying themselves. The bodies of these things, be they plants or bees or my brother or whatever, they have a growth, they reproduce, if you cut them, they will heal. And I almost said a system. They have a system that will heal them. And that's actually vestigial problem here, is that they are healed by their internal structure, which is their form. Anyway, all of this is just to premise the notion of faculties at all. This is how Aristotle delineated these different species. What can they do? What's the limit of their act? That is their form. So, but with animals and with human beings, you have in fact, with all living things, you have this notion of an inner world and an outer world, which are in tension with each other all the time. So you have an external world, which is the sort of origin of our sense, and then you have an inner world, which is sort of the origin of our motion in that world. And again, it is important to underscore that you don't necessarily have that with the robots, so to speak. Even if there is some kind of mechanism that's been built, it needs maintenance by human form, even if it is a self-learning thing. So anyway, that's just a preface that you can't just put these faculties next to each other like an equation. There's a sort of ecology, which we call psychology, which can't really be done on robots. So anyway, back to the topic at hand, which is, what are these inner sensory faculties? So, maybe I introduced this last week by saying, in grade school, we're all taught that we have 5 senses. Maybe your parents teach you about them. Maybe you learn about them from reading or from even watching TV, Sesame Street or something like that. But for thousands of years, it was understood that there were also inner senses, and they tended to be located in the brain by the various medical people. But that really sort of vanished. And so I will retread what Mark outlined earlier, which is that this all begins, the action of the inner senses begins where they touch the outer senses, which is at the common sense, where all those 5 senses are integrated, each of their particular ones, into one integral, what was called by the medievals a phantasm, which is roughly translated to an appearance, but it's not just a visual picture. It can be an auditory picture. So imagine a car beeping or whatever. So you hear the car beeping, and you can picture that there's, this metal structure that can move and kill you. That is actually all of the inner senses working together. to make that appraisal. Now, if you hear a car beeping on your computer speakers, it takes a training of the perception to know that that's not something that's going to kill you, you know? So anyway, back to maybe St. Thomas, I think.
Well, we're going to need a fairly good drill down here, Peter, on cogitative,
Okay.
and maybe even some discussion about particulars versus universals.
Yeah. That's actually exactly where I was going to take this. So, one of the places where St. Thomas talks about the cogitative power is, he's a Catholic theologian, so he talks about it in relationship to one of the 10 Commandments, which is "Thou shalt honor your father and mother." So, the intellect understands universals. That is, it is purely formal. It touches no matter at all. It knows father. It knows these, what were called by the medievals, universals. But the way that is practically acted on in the human being, this sort of meaning in process that Mark is talking about, St. Thomas says that through the intellect, thou shalt honor your father and mother. And through the cogitative, it's how you know that this is your father. This is your mother. So you don't share that cogitative power with anybody else. It lives in you, and you make use of it, and it makes use of you. And really, it deals with these sort of particulars, which are in matter, and are also sort of prepositional in their structure. So this tree, that apple, this particular matter at hand. And since it touches the intellect, it is embedded with loads of meaning, which has great implications for the range of activity available to the memorative power in storing these things and rearranging them in different sort of hierarchies of importance and things like that. So that is sort of where the rubber meets the road, but maybe more is the sort of metaphor of wheel and axle, where they never actually touch the intellect and the cogitative power, but they're in this constant relationship. So the cogitative power is in your brain. It's actually material. It's not some detached ghost or something like that. But it is the means, the instrument through which we read the world, without which we would understand nothing. So this goes back to Aristotle's notion that without a phantasm, the soul understands nothing. So, yeah. How is that drilling, Mark? I could give some other examples, but
yeah, I think it's important here to recognize that Aristotle's approach was not the only approach going on at the same time.
Right.
Right. We can talk here because we've got Aquinas on the screen, and Aquinas is the one who retrieved the full corpus of Aristotle. But there was a whole lot of conflict going on over the course of a long period of time, and the obvious combatant in this is Aristotle's teacher Plato. But that really greatly oversimplifies things, because in fact we're dealing with 1,000 years, 1,500 years between or more between Aquinas and these two characters. So it's very mixed up. But Plato's view is often summarized as saying that the senses are all illusions, that we're never going to get to the bottom of things by discussing these senses. And this then winds up all the way in the 20th century with Whitehead saying that all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato, as if the Aristotelian side of this didn't matter. So I just don't want to leave the impression that there weren't other alternatives, that there weren't other ways these things wove in and out of each other. But at a critical time in history, the late 19th century, at precisely the time when modern psychology is being transformed into human engineering, which we'll get a chance to talk about my essay with this group in the future. Precisely at that point, Aristotle was brought back in briefly. And so this is, it's an ongoing conflict within particularly Western civilization, how to deal with this. The reason why I bring this up is because this is not just about your life or my life or our families or what happens to the United States or who gets elected. This really is at the very most basic level, the question of whether Oswald Spengler was correct 100 years ago when he published his 2-volume Decline of the West. Many things spun off of that, and many others have considered the possibility that the West is finished for what it is worth in Spengler. His view was that Russia would replace the West as the first major displacement of power. This is published in 1918. So the Russian Revolution had just happened. So that might have had something to do with his view. But ultimately, his view is that the Chinese would wind up as the dominant culture on Earth. And so to some extent, this whole conversation here is not just a interesting conversation about the human psyche. It's not just an interesting conversation about how each of us lives our lives and whether we're healthy and whether we're happy or not. But we are really talking about world-shaping ideas here.
Mark, can I go ahead and I want to recap my understanding based on my reading of this essay. And I want you guys to comment.
The Julian Peguer essay, you mean?
Yes, Peguer essay,
Great.
yes. So I was actually very impressed with the cogitative sense. Now, I was very familiar with it indirectly through Magda Arnold. Now, the best I understand it is that the notion of common sense, I'm trying to map, the terms that most people would understand. Common sense is basically kind of conglomeration of all the senses producing like percepts that are now accessible to the internal senses.
It's a kind of synesthesia.
Actually, we would probably reserve the word percept for the cogitative power, not for the common sense.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to map into like how people think about things. I'm trying to give them like equivalent terms to understand what the cogitative sense is. So, and the thing is that I've been looking at it only for a week. I've only through this essay. So correct me where I'm wrong. So let me go ahead and, talk about as I understand it, and then, please correct me. So you're taking in information, your connection to the outside world is through this common sense, which is pretty close to kind of a conglomeration of senses that as understood. Now, that is connected to imagination. Imagination is basically stores up the results of sensory data, but is also able to kind of manipulate it and project it so that it produces kind of additional possibilities, which are actually not coming from.
So an example given is you can imagine gold, you can imagine a mountain, and a human being can compound those things to something they haven't seen before, a golden mountain. right? Yeah. And that's an example actually given by Avicenna, I believe.
Wonderful. And then what the cogitative faculty, I found it amazing because it's at one level, it is psychological. At another level, it is epistemological. It's the core of epistemology, of kind of connecting up the data from the senses, seeing patterns in it, and connecting it to a universal. On one hand, so at the kind of the abstraction level, so it's like the heart of epistemology. And at the same time, it is also heart of ethics, because it is taking the widest universal conceptions that you have and saying, what do these things mean in action, and actually directing, producing the appraisals based on the universals, universal principles, to do things that you need to do. So it is like the heart of, it's like a linchpin of taking in information, epistemologically, connecting the sensory data with the widest abstractions, and then making those widest abstractions drive ethical action. So it looks like a linchpin to me. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
Yeah, I think so. The only thing that I would add to what you said, Shrikant, is this is where time comes in. It turns out that there's no time in the imagination. These phantasms are not time stamped. They're not exactly. They're not sequenced. Mm-hmm. The relationship of time is just a relationship. I mean, it can, of course, be a dimension. It can be a variable in an equation. It can be any number of things. But in this sense, it's a dynamic relationship. It's the developing component of this. And that does not exist in imagination. It exists in the faculty of memory, and winds up being enormously important. So the linchpin here, just noting, Bill Frezza and I had this conversation this past week. Physics equations are out of time, outside time. You'll see all sorts of science fiction based on this, where time can be reversed. The whole time machine idea, and the whole idea of in fact, moving things forward, moving things backwards from a physics standpoint doesn't matter. But from a human standpoint, of course, it matters enormously. And so this is the subconscious sense in which we recognize change, development, and displacement through time. Absolutely making it the linchpin you just described.
Excellent. I want to also add one thing. The faculty of memory, I was very struck by, because it is very different in this conception than how people think about memory. Because what memory in Aquinas' view, is the place where the results of the cogitative faculty is stored. So it is where all your conclusions, all the results of it, it's not sensory data. It is the results of the cogitative faculty. So it is enormously important, because that serves as a guide for future cogitation.
I'm quite confident that if we are successful in getting enough people interested, and frankly, some funding associated with that interest, that there will be some quite remarkable results in both the neuroscience of memory and the therapeutic dimensions of memory as they occur in Alzheimer's and so forth. Billions of dollars have been spent, understandably, on these health problems. Mm-hmm. Many people on the screen here are familiar with this, maybe in their own personal lives, certainly in their parents and their family lives. This has become a very big deal as our lifespans have increased. And what we know about those topics, I believe, will be revolutionized when we bring this faculty psychology understanding into that work.
Wonderful. The next thing I want to do is...
I wanted to add something
Go ahead,
real quick,
please.
Shrikant, if I could.
Please.
Which is so much of what we talk about with memory is stuff that really is the action of the imaginative power in this schema, where, oh, I remember the smell of my mother's house, or my grandmother's house. That is actually the imaginative power that recalls that scent. The memorative power is my mother's house. Like, you know what I mean? It's the sort of ablative where the thing comes from, and even the fact that those words are in that order, that's the action of intellect, touching, cogitative, and memorative. But the actual pulling up of that smell, of that picture, of any of those things, divorced from time, divorced from their meaning or intention, resequenced, as Mark alluded to, is still taking place in the imaginative power in the body. And I want to emphasize that because like any part of the body, any organ, these things can suffer atrophy. Others can suffer hypotrophy, where the entire organism is sort of funneled into the function of one single organ. So I just wanted to underscore that before we move on.
It's very important what Peter has just said here. So all of this money being spent on researching memory, all the divisions between short-term memory, long-term memory, this is not the memorative power that's being talked about here. And so the notion that we take in information and we store it, and there's multiple kinds of storage. Again, this is sort of the model of the computer. The computer CPU has a hierarchy of memories, starting with the registers and the caches and so forth. And so to pattern the human memory on this, it may be one of the greatest crimes that's ever been, crime against the psyche that's ever been committed. To restore actual memory and the way that patterns are actually being recognized and meaning is being generated is at the heart of this larger topic, which is the, some people call the meaning crisis in which we're now living. And so I'll just note here that Peter and I and Adam and another colleague of ours wrote an article entitled Making Sense in a World in Transition, which was published by Notre Dame a month or so ago to announce all of the work we're talking about here today.
Thank you, Mark. So just to make it concrete, again, I'm going to, I'm the advocate for the listeners, both for who are here as well as the YouTube people. So I want to make sure that everything is as clear and explained in multiple directions so that people can get it. So one way I see it is that if you look at the imaginative faculty, the television is a classic example of overload of that. So you're basically bombarded with all this sensory data, which is actually just, flickering images. And it is producing this massive number of things in your imagination, which are not real. And that dominates your consciousness. This, as opposed to, let's say, you are studiously studying in a library where you are trying to put together the works, in Library of Alexandria, or where you're trying to take in all the results of thoughts of people, of yourself and other people. So that's kind of equivalent of the products of the cogitative faculty. That's what you're taking in. So it's watching TV 4 hours a day or 8 hours a day versus studying, something like that. But that's, if I wanted to put it in perceptual terms, that's how I'm thinking about it. Peter and Mark, is that a fair comparison?
Yeah, I think overall there's some nuance in the way that television sort of used to work compared to the way that it works now, which is, I would say we actually really don't have television today at all. in terms of like thing that's functioning in the world. I would recommend a look at how the actual the properties of that cathode ray tube, which shoots out, you know, red, green, and blue light in these sort of quantized things that actually aren't really pixels at all, but they're blasted at you, and they're totally different from the displays that we're looking at right now. Like they function completely differently. And again, I will say last week that there's really no image on the TV screen at all. It's a flickering illusion. But the point that I think is worth underscoring underneath that is the sort of broadcast fashion of the thing, which really offers the illusion not only to look at the flickering images, but to divorce from time, for everything to happen now, to sort of dim down the guard of memory. And sometimes that's called the suspension of disbelief. And I think the way that the computers are networked and the way that structure operates just couldn't be more different. And I'm sure Mark can get into the particulars of that.
Sure. Mark?
But to Shrikant's point, nonetheless, we have adopted the language of Walter Ong, who was a very important student of Marshall McLuhan's. And so for those who are following the bouncing ball here, McLuhan is a critical source for almost everything that we do. And indeed, our exploration of the inner senses came directly as a result of a dissatisfaction or a questioning whether McLuhan knew this stuff and how much he could possibly have used it if he understood it better. The language of Walter Ong is that the television world is what he called secondary orality. And so this will throw you back into the time that Julian James referred to as bicamerality. So we have to update this using the knowledge of this group. We have returned to a kind of bicamerality under television conditions. And we could try to describe what that means in terms of the inner senses. But it's very important to note here that for the memorative faculty to operate to its fullest, it must also be externalized. It is not sufficient to have this be entirely an internal facility. The faculty of the soul is us internally, so memory is a faculty of the soul, but it wasn't until we became literate. So Shrikant has suggested with his library or a piece of his library behind him on the screen here, that there's a big difference between binge watching on Netflix and getting lost in the library over the weekend. And yes, those are quite different, or for many people would be very different psychological experiences. But what is sort of left out of that is the fact that the library is an external component of memory.
Yes. So
externalizing our memory turns out to be incredibly important to strengthen the internal faculty. I was recently reading a commentary about how repetition shows up in the I Ching. I'm now in the process of trying to, in addition to getting neuroscience on board, in addition to getting therapeutics and clinical psychological work on board here, I would very much like to take what you have heard from Brian McVeigh and others about Julian James and extend that to China, India, Japan, and other places, which will require recruiting scholars from those areas to do that work. But the I Ching, in its original formulation, repeats itself all over the place. So that's an indication that repetition is something that was necessary in an oral world, though in a bicameral world. We're now in a very different situation. So secondary literacy is what digital brings into our lives.
I want to add one thing, which that literacy and that orality are in a real tension right now. Bill Frezza mentioned on the chat there on the side, I'll mention for people here, that Twitter is the new voices of the gods flooding into our brains, which I thought was funny. And I thought it was worth mentioning that they each have their own mask or avatar. And if you block, you can do this with a Google Chrome extension. You can actually block specific elements of a page. So you can experience Twitter or Facebook or any of these things without images simply by disabling the thing, that particular element. So Twitter without pictures is like a newspaper without a dateline. It's a surrealist poem. It literally makes no sense. You need the mask in order for the medium to operate that way. And there's another factor here, which is the way that these timelines are structured are not chronological. The Greeks had two words for time: chronos, the sort of movement of the sun or the planets, whatever, and kairos, which is a sort of timing or human time.
Correct.
You know, what time did you go home? 3 o'clock. What time do you tell dad you crashed the car after he had his drink? Quoting Doug Rushkoff. Mm-hmm. So that's the difference. So, but kairos, this sort of human timing, divorced from chronos, where you have a timeline that's organized by what computers have been told that you might like to see in order for you to stay there mm-hmm. long enough, is a sort of fantasy timeline. It's not a memory timeline at all. It's not past as past. It's you as present. So that's Doug Rushkoff's book, Present Shock. But I want to emphasize that just like the sort of universal and the particular live in this kind of interval, this sort of human timing and the timing of the outside world also live in this kind of tension.
Excellent.
So, yeah.
A great point. I just want to close this particular thing by saying you can see these faculties operative right now. Right. You're hearing us. What I keep saying, this is not TV. So you can actually just regard it as TV. But moment you take your pen, think about something and write it down, you are using your memorative faculty and you are emphasizing it. And that is what is allowing you to use your cogitative faculty to the fullest. So that's why we talk about pen and paper as being critical for these meetups. That's exactly the same point about these faculties. What I want to do is I want to close by, I want to first read out this summary of the essay, the conclusion of the essay. It's very short, but it masterfully captures the nature of the cogitative faculty. So you have that before you go into the breakout rooms. What is the cogitative faculty? It is the master faculty of practical people, of artisans, of people who know how to do things. It is the sense of fortunate discoveries, happy combinations, and success in action. It is the internal sense of the good proper to an individual and consequently proper to the entire species. The cogitative is therefore the real liaison agent between the spiritual world of our ideas and the corporeal world of our senses. It is a priceless instrument for the intellect, whether there be question of speculation or of action. The cogitative is rightly called the particular reason and the intellect of the individual. The cogitative, on the contrary, contrary to instinct, is essentially founded on consciousness. By its very nature, the cogitative perfects itself in speed of action, sureness of vision, richness of experience, and thus prepares an ever more perfect instrument for intellectual progress. The cogitative aims particularly at placing the inferior portions, vegetative and sensitive, at the service of the superior and rational portions, thus contributing to the good of the whole, the complete and ordered satisfaction of all the faculties in a human person. The cogitative faculty must take up again in our psychology the place so generously marked out for it by St. Thomas Aquinas. I think this is a good way of summarizing it. Folks, what we are going to do now is we are now going to go into breakout rooms. I'm going to give a chance for Mark and Peter to say any last thoughts before it's going to take me about 30 seconds to set up the breakout rooms. Go ahead.
I have a quick thought, which is the difference between this and instinct. Animals have a similar sense outlined by the medievals called the estimative faculty. And the difference between estimative and cogitative is that the cogitative touches the intellect, thus is not instinct, and has been called instinct even by people who tried to retrieve this in the early 20th century. And on to you, Mark, if you have anything to say. And
I'll just finish with a comment, because there's been a few non-human faces on the screen here, agreeing with what Peter just said. Debbie Newman and I went away last weekend to the Berkshires. And when she came home, her cat had a difficult time recognizing her. And so the estimative sense in Debbie's cat, Poonam, actually took a couple of days for the cat to remember who Debbie was. And then all of a sudden the cat was sleeping with Debbie at night again, and so forth. So this all becomes enormously important, my final word before the breakout, when we consider the robots. This will turn out to be where all of these tensions express themselves. And I hope we have a chance in the future to talk about some of those dimensions as well.
Wonderful. Folks, give me just 10 seconds. I'm just setting things up here.
Hope everyone's having a good weekend or whatever time you're watching this.
Wonderful. All right. We are ready to get started here. I got so interested in this discussion that I forgot to set all of these things up. Give me a second. All right, starting the breakout rooms now. So rules for the breakout rooms, I'm going to go ahead and post them in the chat. Rule number 1, let everybody talk for about 2 minutes about their impressions, their questions, put them on the table first, and then you can go ahead and discuss. The rules are, as always, keep on topic, be brief, and be courteous, encourage others to speak. During the breakout rooms, collect all your key takeaways and one big question that you have. When you come back, you'll get a chance to ask that question to both Mark and Peter, starting the breakout rooms now. We're going to start with Stefan, followed by Mike. Stefan.
Yes, Mark. So I was going to ask you this as a follow-up to what I asked you in the room, which is, and I hope I can word this properly, but so it seems to me like the writing externalizes your thoughts. And I'm wondering if that played any part in people externalizing God or gods over time, because way back when nobody could write, I believe like the ancient Greek period, they thought that the gods were more like an internal possession kind of phenomenon, but now it's become like Jesus is out there. And I'm wondering if the scribal revolution has played any part in that coming to fruition.
Mark, go ahead, you're on mute.
The answer, Stefan, is obviously yes. And the study that we've been doing about Julian Jaynes here, that Shrikant has led, the broader topic title of the axial age, which generated all of the world's great religions. On that, amplify that one specific way. At the point that the notion, noticing frozen faces here, so.
There is a problem with your audio, with your connection, Mark.
Okay.
But we can hear you. You can try. You can continue.
My audio is not working well, I guess. The answer, Stefan, is
okay.
Is yes.
Yes.
And,
okay.
You know, in the beginning was the word, so they say in John 1:1.
Mark, could you just leave Zoom and come back in? I think that might help.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Next question is from Mike. Mike, I'll give you 1 minute.
Could I be put on later on the queue until
Sure.
Mark comes back?
Sounds good. Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Shrikant, and thanks to Mark and Peter for a very interesting presentation. One thing I would disagree with a little bit is the thing about television is fantasy. It's not reality. It's if you look at my picture here and you would come and visit beautiful Tacoma, Washington, I think you'd see just about the same thing that you're seeing on this picture. Without getting too politically incorrect or getting too much politics, I'm afraid a lot of people are bashing the media because they, you know, we're trying to kill the messenger because they're bringing things that they don't want the public to see. But although to me, television, I mean, it's always the fact versus fiction deal. Sure, there's dramatizations on TV that are completely not real. But the camera sees about pretty much what our eye sees. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The camera, this is actually why I brought up the difference between the world that we live in now and the world of television as it was really before 2010, before they turned off all the analog signals. It's not so much what you're looking at. What you're looking at, you can it, in fact, is deliberately crafted to appear just as much as the real thing as possible. It's rather the distance, the structure of communication, which is instantaneous, one to everybody. You know, in the 50s, there were 3 networks. These are all carefully crafted productions, and the medium itself, just by virtue of the fact of it being in instant matter, transforms everything. And the fantasy element, I think you're not on television right now necessarily. But the truth is we actually don't know what's behind anybody's frames. And that's important. There is a limit to what we have here. But yeah, that's how I would answer that, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Next up is going to be Mike, Becky, and Kevin. Mike, I'll give you 1 minute.
I'd like to wait until
Mark is here.
Mark is back.
Oh, okay.
I'm back.
Oh, great. During the breakout things, and some of these ideas are Bill Fraser's, I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, Bill, but I apologize. The things that you did kind of say that the church was involved in a lot of the cogitative knowledge of Aquinas, and but the entire Summa is also kind of biased toward getting a just person, to get him to be able to realize what God is all about and the everlasting soul is all about. Now, Leibniz and Kant kind of refuted a lot of those things. I wonder if later in your chapters you go into that, or you have a reason for some of that. And I have also a point about your pattern recognition stuff that I've been talking about for years after that.
A simple answer to your question, Mike, is that Leibniz was on the job to run the Vatican Library. Leibniz was very devout Christian, dealing with a world that was trying to represent all these things in mathematical terms. So it would be incorrect to state that he refuted these things. And Kant is a fascinating figure who, in fact, beneath all of what we know about him, what he's published, as I indicated earlier, was a mystic. And the distinction between new nominal and phenomenal is enormously important. And so religion, in particular versions of the Christian religion, are deeply embedded in everything done by Leibniz and Kant.
It's also worth mentioning that the cogitative power and this understanding of it precedes St. Thomas too. It's in Avicenna, it's in Bishop Nestorius, it's in, and that's like 400 AD. And really it comes from Aristotle, which is from about 350 or so BC. So,
okay. Well, all right. I'd like to add a couple comments about pattern recognition.
Mike, briefly, okay?
Very briefly.
Okay.
You talk about 100 billion neurons, which sounded like an infinite number. So, but you can't store what you need in 100 billion neurons to recognize all the things on, say, the Super Bowl football game. So I think that there are two people that. There are many people who've talked about the fact that the memory is not in the neurons. The memory is in the synaptic junctions, and it's stored in a quantum way. So a single synapse has an entire picture, and that's how the retrieval can work better. Now Penrose's book on that subject and papers kind of talk
Mike,
about how that works.
Always. Just make it short.
No, the point. I think the point of it is that the retrieval and storage needs to be considered in light of those things. Now, Bill Fraser answered that a little better than I did, but maybe.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Let Mark and Peter respond. There is about 7 people waiting to ask questions.
Got it. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate you being the resident historian here. Appreciate all your knowledge and thoughts, but I have to keep things on track so that we can.
I don't consider it. I consider it half gadfly rather than. Yeah. But
thank you.
Glad to be part of this.
Thank you.
Mike, thanks for the question. I've met Roger Penrose. I've had a brief conversation with him, and he agreed with me. We have a lot to learn. Whether quantum is actually involved at the synaptic level is an interesting theory. He would not consider it to be anything more than that. And so I look forward to what Penrose and others have to say once faculty psychology has been fully incorporated into their thinking.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Becky, Kevin, Brian, Maritza, and Jade. Becky, go ahead.
Mark, can you expound on your criticism of artificial intelligence?
Very briefly, I'm about to launch a campaign to eliminate artificial intelligence as a phrase. Of course, I will fail, and I may even attract the wrong kind of attention. But intelligence is not what a computer has. Intelligence is not what an artificial human has. But instead, as we were just discussing with Mike, it's a version of pattern recognition. So what needs to be done here, I think, is a much more elaborate understanding of pattern recognition. It turns out that the artificial intelligence world, so-called, has finally figured out that the big problem that they cannot solve is common sense. As we've been describing here, common sense is just the beginning. So what's going to happen, I believe, Becky, is that the so-called AI world, it's really the APR, artificial pattern recognition world, is going to have to come to grips with cogitative sense. And I don't think that is immediately on the horizon. My guess is that nobody from that world will be listening to this video or reading our paper, but it's inevitable. And so much as with quantum theories about memory and so forth, and there's a vast array of this out there. Complexity science now needs to be re-examined. And in the process, I think we'll come to a much better understanding of what it is that we're dealing with.
Thank you, Becky and Mark. Next up is going to be Kevin, Brian, Maritza, and Chade. Kevin.
Yes, thank you, Frank, organizers, and glad that Peter and Mark present this awesome topic. It's lots to take. Lots of questions, but I'm going to take my takeaways. Our knowledge is accumulated. It's all inclusive over mutual exclusive. It's not a replacement for single, not deletion. I respect everybody's thinking, but my 2 cents about the TV. I can share one story. There was one TV in the whole school. We watch it together for Olympic game. For the that's, you can imagine that kind of feeling. We cannot see that's TV whole thing. So our knowledge, experience add up. It's not one or another. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, I completely agree. This accumulation of knowledge and an understanding of the world is really most obviously seen in newborn babies as they come to know the world, beginning by trying to swallow it and ending up about 10 or 11, 12 years later, becoming able to swim through that environment with the accumulation of the language that they have absorbed in their environment, whether that's writing or speaking, or even just relying on others who can write or speak. Yeah, that's a fascinating aspect of all this. Thank you.
I often sign off my discussions, particularly when there's an argument involved, or somebody wants to try to press through to the some sort of a conclusion. I will often sort of diffuse that by simply saying we all have a lot to learn, and so this accumulation that you're describing, we're heading into a remarkable period of that accumulation as we shift from fantasy to memory under digital conditions. I just hope I live long enough to see how this plays out.
Thank you. Next up is Brian.
I wanted to follow up on Stefan's question. I thought that was very intriguing. With the end of the bicameral, we had the externalization of God. With the advent of Scribal, we had the externalization of God. And I guess a couple questions, maybe I guess it's a question. Number one, and when we have the Scribal, it seems to me, and do you agree, there's a shift from the God, which was let's say embedded in experience and relationships and ritual, a shift from that God that you personally experienced to a God that was presented to you by a messenger. And the best historical event I keep coming back to, and I was reminded of it again, is Ezra coming out of captivity in Babylon and going to the illiterate Jewish population in Jerusalem and read them the new version of the Bible and telling them that they had, the Jewish men, that they had to abandon their non-Jewish wives. And they did it. And they did it because Ezra told them that God said they should. So I think there might be a shift there from the, God as an integral part of your life to God delivered by a messenger. And then something more immediate then is if we can transfer God to the messenger, then, and in the way that Stefan really evoked, are the talking heads on TV, are they our new gods, like the Wizard of Oz?
Well, as you know, the talking heads are just reading teleprompters. And so there's a whole army of people behind them who are writing all of this sort of text. But Brian, I think you put your finger on something very important here. The decline of the West is simply a result of losing Christianity. There's nothing else to it. That then, of course, raises the question, in order for the West to not just simply wipe itself out, will the West have to rediscover Christianity? And the answer to that question cannot be a simple yes. So what you're suggesting is going through these paradigm shifts, our relationship to the transcendental must change. And so I'm a devout Catholic. I'll be leaving this conversation to go to a Latin Mass at the other end of town here. Do I think that everybody's going to join the Catholic Church under digital conditions? No, I do not. Do I think that the Catholic Church is going to play an important role under digital conditions? Yes, I absolutely do. So how that sorts itself out, how our relationship to the transcendental sorts itself out under digital conditions is a really important question. We know the question is important. We don't yet have an answer.
Wonderful. Folks, I want to remind you there are two meetups, both Stefan and Brian and everybody else. There are two meetups that we are doing that are actually connected to this. At 5 o'clock, Merlin Donald is going to be here. And we're going to be talking about how consciousness changes with every transition of technology, from oral to scribal to print. We're going to trace how consciousness changes across technologies. So that's going to be at 5 o'clock today. On next Saturday, the coming Saturday at 12 o'clock, Brian McVeigh is going to be here, and he's going to be talking about the psychology of the Bible. And we'll be talking about both these mentalities in the Bible and where you can actually clearly see it. So those, I would recommend both of them. Next up is going to be Maritza, followed by Jade. Maritza.
Oh man, the last comment by Mark kind of threw me for a loop a little bit. I'm not entirely convinced that my brain has finished processing this essay, to be honest. I probably could have a question for every page. But I actually think I want to comment on the last thing that Mark said, and I'll try to tie it in a little bit with what I was going to ask. The idea that the decline of the West is prevaricated by the demise of Christianity, my initial instinct is to reject that premise. I do have to admit that from a purely intellectual perspective, I can see merits to that statement. But if we consider that one of the very first things in the essay I actually forgot about it. And then I was surprised when you came back to it and tied it back in the end of the essay, this concept of universal law and the fact that the cogitative sense, as you've described it, you took us on a journey and you pulled apart these, or I don't know if it was you, the essay took us on a journey and it pulled apart all the various aspects that could construe the cogitative faculties. And then some very bold statements were made, like, this is a link. There appears to be corollary here with intellectual virtue. And we're looking at morals. And I think actually the term used here was prudence, syllogism, right? And so we use these, we take these things and we make the very bold statement that, the cogitative is vital. I mean, the word vital paints a picture, right? And it says it's vital and it's a key to practical human life. I don't believe the same is true of Christianity per se. I feel like using the word Christianity there limits the scope of what the essay is pointing out to us in how much we as human beings today are suffering for the lack of acknowledging and perhaps using or making concerted effort to engage, the cogitative sense. So, I think the key here is that as we go from scribal and we go down through digital, what we're losing here is, and it is pointed out, the idea of experience, the idea that none of our anything sits by itself. We are standing on the shoulders of so much experience or information or data, as it were. And it's only by acknowledging that we can then, consider the intellectual data that goes into so many things that we do, and we can elevate ourselves by not dismissing. And I feel like Christianity is a huge breadth of information that cannot be thrown away, but to say that it is at the same integral level, I don't know. Where does that fit in with this concept of us trying to create a universal law that will help us be, better humans going forward?
I think, Maritza, that's very important. And I'm not here as an evangelist. I'm only suggesting, to be specific, that the publication in 1918 by Oswald Spengler in German of The Decline of the West is intimately tied to his recognition in that very same year of 1918, although some think it was 1917. What's the difference? Max Weber, one of the founders of sociology, gave a lecture in Munich, the title of which was Science as Vocation, in which he says the world has become disenchanted. And that disenchantment specificically meant the end of Christianity in Germany. And so we've got Spengler, we've got Weber, right on top of each other, identifying a situation which we are now living in. Whether Christianity, in one form or another, winds up becoming the central way that we relate to the transcendent will depend on many, many factors here. But I'll just finish by saying that the basis of a universal law has already been described. And there's a massive literature associated with it. It's called natural law. And that natural law literature is overwhelmingly Christian, as is all the discussion about virtue. And all I'm saying here is that we will need to retrieve those conversations for us to move forward. That experience will need to be re-experienced, and then we'll be able to move forward.
I would add that the cogitative sense, the cogitative power, is not necessarily interchangeable with Christianity as such. In fact, as I was saying earlier, a lot of Christians, even Catholics, who originally sort of brought this understanding of faculty psychology to the world in a way, with the Baghdad House of Wisdom before, and Aristotle, the pagan and classical Greece. There is, though, a sorry, I lost my train of thought, but I was going to say, wow, that was a total zap. Sorry.
I'll jump in on behalf of anyone here of the Jewish faith. It turns out that Maimonides was an Aristotelian as well. And so people may be familiar with his Guide for the Perplexed. It turns out there's another document, which I think typically is called, at least in English, the 8 chapters. And there's this 8 chapters is a kind of a preface to the guide. And fascinatingly enough, he goes through the inner senses in the 8 chapters. So no, this doesn't have to be Christian. Peter's exactly right. And in particular, I'm very excited about the possibility of bringing this understanding to some of our colleagues in China.
I remember what I was going to say. Thank you, Mark. And that reminded me that even in the Christian world, and especially even the Catholic world, a lot of this understanding has been completely forgotten, and in fact, totally erased. If you went to a Catholic school in the 20th century, you didn't learn about these things. And we're in the position of talking with academics who are on the fringe of things, who are sort of just now working on this and are on the precipice of figuring out how it's even relevant to our world today. So I would say that there is, as Mark has said, we all have a lot of learning to do.
Wonderful. Last question is from Jade. Jade, if you could keep your question brief.
Yep, I can do that. I think then I'll jump for Brian Nelson. He was talking about the TV, and a few other people have talked about it. I want to refer everybody to American Gods. It was a book. I read part of the book. I haven't read the full book. And also a TV show series. And it actually touches on kind of what people are putting forth. Basically, it's all of the deities from all different cultures around the world. And they're basically fighting the television. They're literally fighting with television and media to remain existent and relevant. Is kind of the gist. That's an oversimplification of the book, but that's the basic premise. One thing that I was saying in the group, because it was kind of at the end, so it didn't get touched on, was also, because I'm seeing that a lot of this is about observation in a certain sense, and the type of observer you are, and somewhat the impact that has on you. So I started bringing up the concept of how, yes, television is different, and perhaps some won't call it TV anymore, but there's so many instances where TV is now interactive. So yes, we have the Zoom, but like you can sit there, Instagram TV, other TV, and you could actually, in real time, talk to the performers, talk to the audience. You can have that thing. So how does that play into everything that is being talked about? Because it just seems like a large part of this seems very much so like it's about the type of observation that you're doing. It's like if I was Jane Goodall sitting in a mountain, I think she was the one with the monkeys and all that other stuff. Like if I was sitting in the mountains just watching, and learning about, you know, how these animals and things work, would you say the same thing as me? Because I guess I don't have the sensory stuff a little bit when I'm looking at something from my television, but at the same time, I'm just being an observer. I'm watching. I'm not necessarily partaking. So those are the things that I'm putting out there.
Peter, this might be a good time to talk about Cydia's classroom. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. Jade, thank you so much. I will bring up that bookmark, but I also wanted to mention, American Gods, I think, is made by Neil Gaiman, based on his book. And yeah, that's a fascinating window into what you're describing. Neil Gaiman, I think one of his favorite authors is a guy named G.K. Chesterton from England, who wrote some fascinating books himself, if you might be interested. One is called The Man Who Was Thursday. That's a fun one. But so this premise of television, the sort of all interactive environment, you can talk about Instagram TV, even TikTok, right? Like, you can not only see a dance, but then you can say, I'm going to dance to it. Or someone asked a question, I'm going to stitch a response to it in real time, and then I'll see comments in real time. So basically, everybody has been invited to be their own television producer, precisely at the time that the world is dominated by a new environment. So everyone's suddenly been given the keys to the old environment, while a new thing is working on us invisibly, evading our perception, evading our instant, obvious sort of observation, as you mentioned. So, you know, there's these environments that are needing to be studied. And so Mark mentioned Cydia's Classroom, which is a book by Marshall McLuhan, I mentioned last Sunday, that sort of takes a radical stance on the role of education in a society. He says, basically, the school is no longer a place that has the answers for you. In fact, there's 1 million times more information outside the classroom than there is inside. But that doesn't mean that we should necessarily eliminate the classroom, as some had suggested. He said, why not put the questions in the classroom and send the students out into the environment to ask those, to look at the answers and then bring them back in and discuss them. And in that book, he lists, I think, about 24 or so properties of the new environment. So he says, you know, look at the properties of newspaper, the properties of television, the properties of the postal service, any of these things. And then there's another chapter that says the effects of those things. But principal to either of those things is what he calls the training of perception. To learn how to see these things that operate sort of invisibly, whether that's in a poem or in the environment, by what he called a figure ground approach. And sorry if this answer is really long, but I love your question.
I want you to continue with the figure ground, because we haven't talked about that enough. I just want to wave goodbye to everybody here and say I've got to go to my next meeting. I will be in the 5 o'clock today with Merlin Donald.
Wonderful.
I'm really looking forward to that. I hope a bunch of the rest of you can join us also. I'm sorry, Peter.
Wonderful. Bye, Mark.
Bye-bye.
So that figure ground approach is, maybe you're familiar with the, we talked about this last week too. You have sort of constitutive elements of a picture that can be seen one way or another, depending on what you focus on, what you bring to the picture. And that's, you know, you have the vase that can look like two faces. You have the dress, which can look, you know, blue and white, or black and gold. But they look different to a photographer or to a seamstress than to someone on a timeline, just seeing the image plucked from its context. And in the same way, TikTok looks different to a teenage girl than it does to maybe another girl who works in the engineering department or in the promotions department. It's that relationship between those two things where the whole can sort of be seen. So I would just recommend that book. I've just started reading it myself, and it really is amazing. I think there's a PDF on it available online. If you just search in quotes on Google, "City as Classroom PDF," you'll find it. And I think you'll find that first chapter especially exciting. Thank you so much, Jade.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Peter. And thanks, Mark. This was a great meetup. And Mark will be back next Sunday at 12 o'clock to talk about inner senses and human engineering. So he will be elaborating on the themes that he started talking about at this time. So don't miss that. All right, folks, thank you very much. And thanks, Peter. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.